Andrew runs www.checktheevidence.com. Unfortunately, some of us are, thanks to the perseverance of truth seekers like Andrew. Please welcome Andrew Johnson.
Thank you very much, Rob. Hopefully the mic's working. It sounds to be working. I might move around for this first part, James, slightly. I'd like to thank James and Jenny for inviting me back to do another talk, and very pleased to be here. I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and particularly those that have come a long distance, so thank you very much. I'll just start off by making a couple of brief sort of announcements, as it were. I've got some booklets and DVDs, as I always bring with me for those that have seen me speak here before. This is 50 pence, booklets 30 pence. And I've also brought with me something else which is rather special. Some of you will know my involvement with a person called Dr. Judy Wood, who's done the only credible research into 9/11, certainly as far as the physical evidence of what happened at the World Trade Center. After a long, hard struggle and several tens of thousands of miles journey from the Far East, I have in my hands a 500-page full-colour book, which is the only book about 9/11 written by a qualified scientist, which will explain to you in very graphic and very great detail how the World Trade Center was destroyed using some type of energy weapon, and the technology of that energy weapon is also known about. It's similar to something called the Hudson effect. There are now 200 copies sitting in London at the docks, which we've had shipped across the Atlantic. This book isn't cheap, because as you can see, it's a very high quality text. I brought it with me today, not for sale, but for those that want to look at it. It'll be available in the interval for you to have a look at. It is available. I've got some flyers, so you can get it from the website. As I say, I'm hoping to get hold of some copies, and I'll probably haven't quite decided how we're going to ship it through the website and whatnot because of the payment and this sort of thing. But it will be made available. It is making an impact. We have a professor of English called Eric Larson, a US-based professor. He has already described it as the most important book of the 21st century, and I agree with him. This is a very, very dangerous book indeed, not only for the mainstream media and all that, but it's also a very dangerous book for the 9/11 truth movement in the world. Nobody will talk about this book. So if you want to have a look at it and get a glimpse of why that is the case, it's here for you to look at.
What's the likely price, Andrew?
The US price is $39.95 plus shipping, so it's on par with a university type textbook. We haven't worked out the UK price yet because it depends on what sort of shipping deals we can get. It weighs £3, so that puts it into a high postage rate, which is a bit of a problem for me. So we've got to work out what's the cheapest way to do it and that sort of thing. But US price is $39.95 plus to the UK $13.95 shipping, because it's expensive to get a heavy object shipped like that from the US. So that's basically that. So anyway, on we go into the main presentation after a little mini featurette, and we'll see where we get to. Here we go.
Today we have with us a group of students among America's best. To you we say, we have only completed a beginning. We leave you much that is undone. There are great ideas undiscovered, breakthroughs available to those who can remove one of truth's protective layers.
So now you know where I got the title for this presentation from Neil Armstrong himself. In this presentation we will examine a range of different evidence which seems to show that much of what we were told and shown about the Apollo moonshot program was false or fake. We will look at likely motives for the fakery, which a lot of people don't go into that much. We'll look at some aspects of Apollo history initially, photographic evidence. I haven't done a great deal of that. All this thing about the shadows, there's a lot of controversy in that, and I don't think you can decide a lot of that one way or the other, but I've got some photo evidence which I think is much more compelling than just the issue of the shadows. We've got some video evidence which you may not have seen before. We're going to look at what the astronauts themselves have said. This is something that's undeniable, and they have said some very, very interesting things about what happened to them on the Apollo missions. We're also going to look at some new evidence from this new probe called Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which was launched, I think, in either 2008 or 2009, and there were some pictures published from Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter when it went over the Apollo landing sites in 2009. I think it was August 2009, but I've got that later in the presentation. And we'll look at how could they possibly have got away with it. The researchers we must thank are these people. There are several others, but these are the prominent researchers which I've pulled a lot of the information from, and I've added just a little bit, probably 5 or 6% in this presentation is my research, and most of it's come from these people. Bill Kaysing is now deceased. Jim Collier, who was a journalist. Bill Kaysing worked for a company called Rocketdyne, which was involved in the Apollo development. Bart Sibrel, he's a kind of controversial figure. He's a sort of some type of fundamentalist Christian as well, which seems to colour some of his research. But he did a bloody good job on some of the films that he made, and I've got some clips of those, which are a bit difficult to watch actually, but he did some great research. And David Percy and Mary Bennett have also written a book called Dark Moon. It's probably, I should know the date, but I think it was published in the 90s. It's not new. And also Ralph Renee, who's kind of one of these rebel thinkers. He also passed away a couple of years ago, I think. So those are the people we've got to thank for primarily for getting this information out. But one of the questions I'm asked when I talk about this is, how could they possibly have got away with faking something like this? And most people cannot believe that they could possibly have got away with faking this, and they will therefore reject anything else that you tell them out of hand, because they think there's no way they could have faked this. Too many people would have a chance to find out about the hoax. That's one of the things that they say, would be impossible to hoax it. There's too many people involved. Well, it kind of assumes that the whole program was faked. In other words, they never built an Apollo rocket, they never built mission control. Of course, that's not true. Of course they built Apollo rockets, of course they built mission control, etc. Only parts of the Apollo program were faked. Of course there were real people from the army involved in this sort of thing. Now, I think most researchers, as far as I can tell, they would agree that the Apollo rockets were real and they took off. I think we can agree on that. There's certain questions about the performance of these rockets that some people ask, like if you watch the Saturn V going up, for example, it's a very, very smoky flame, and I've read something that they think that was done to make it look more spectacular, and the actual performance of the rocket, it wouldn't really necessarily give off a lot of smoke, because that would mean it wasn't efficient or something. And my current understanding is I think the capsules took astronauts into orbit. Now, there's arguments over this, but I believe that the astronauts were taken into orbit on most of the missions, and I believe they stayed in Earth orbit. But again, once you get into this, that becomes very difficult. But with this in mind, much of the effort in the program was taken up with the work in these two areas. As with the 1960s technology, it was still a difficulty. What I mean is that just to get somebody off the ground safely and into orbit was pretty damn tricky. And to get them to the moon was obviously just a bit of trickiness on top of that. So, they could still have done a genuine space program, but not gone to the moon, and you would have had most of the furnishings, most of the technology there, right? So it's not as if the whole thing was completely fake, which is often, an implicit assumption which is made. So in essence, once the capsule was aloft, the only source of video and photo information was NASA. So providing that you could control those video feeds and photographic information, you could control entirely what people saw on the ground. And you only perhaps maybe had 50 or 100 people perhaps at a guess who would know that it was being faked. And only NASA was communicating with the astronauts directly. There were a few people listening in, but obviously there wasn't a two-way communications path. Most people at NASA would never have considered that they were involved in something which was being hoaxed. They would never question what was on the screen in front of them. In fact, if you looked at a screen in front of you showing, the output of the rocket or the current sort of force of gravity on the capsule or something, or whatever the read-off was, you wouldn't know whether you were looking at something that was real or from a simulation, quite frankly. So bear that in mind. But now we're going to look at some aspects of Apollo history, and I've got a couple of video clips here from V2 to Saturn V. Remember, the V2 rockets was how this all started in the Second World War, and the Doodleburg and all that. Let's see, I've got some clips somewhere here. Right. But yes, we've all heard about the paperclip conspiracy. I watched a BBC Horizon programme, I think in about 1982, something like that. It was called the Paperclip Conspiracy, and it brought forward the information that most of the NASA rocket scientists were brought over from Germany, from NASA Germany, from the V2 programme. So if you're importing Nazi rocket scientists into the US American rocketry programme, was this a healthy pedigree, do you think? Were these people trustworthy? Now, there's a very interesting clip here. Let's see, I think I might have this in the video, but let's see.
Under Adolf Hitler's leadership, a Nazi war criminal named Werner von Braun built thousands of V2 rockets through slave labor that were launched against London.
Once the rockets are up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department, says Werner von Braun. Some have harsh words for this man of renown, but some think our attitude should be one of gratitude.
After the war, the Soviets and the Americans divided up the rocket technology. The Americans brought home over 100 top Nazi propulsion specialists, including their leading rocket scientist, von Braun.
Say rather that he's apolitical.
Since most people wanted to come live in America, the Soviet Union was given most of the hardware, which, to a large degree, contributed to their victory with Sputnik. By 1961, Nazi rocket scientists such as von Braun maintained a close relationship with President John F. Kennedy, as he moved to fulfill his promise to land Americans on the moon before the end of 1969. Yet today, NASA says it will be 2018 before we go back to the moon, despite having supposedly been there over 35 years ago. In 1953, von Braun wrote a book on how to get to the moon, titled Conquest of the Moon. On page 14 of his book, he states, "It is commonly believed that man will fly directly from the Earth to the moon, but to do this, we would require a vehicle of such gigantic proportions that it would prove an economic impossibility. It would have to develop sufficient speed to penetrate the atmosphere and overcome the Earth's gravity, and, having traveled all the way to the moon, it must still have enough fuel to land safely and make the return trip to Earth. Furthermore, in order to give the expedition a margin of safety, we would not use one ship alone, but a minimum of 3. Calculations have been carefully worked out on the type of vehicle we would need for the non-stop flight from the Earth to the moon in return. The figures speak for themselves. Each rocket ship would be taller than New York's Empire State Building, 1,250 feet, and weigh about 10 times the tonnage of the Queen Mary, or some 800,000 tons. The Apollo program's 3-stage Saturn V was only 3,000 tons. The Saturn V was 266 times smaller than it had to be.
So they have one of the most well-known Nazi rocket scientists saying that they'd need a rocket as big as the Empire State Building to get to the moon. So how did they manage to do it with one that was, well, I can't remember the figure now, 20 times smaller? So already there are question marks from one of the main, I mean, if it was just some, journalist commentator, but this is von Braun, the rocket expert, who said this. So, anyway, we had the various Earth orbiting programs such as Gemini and Mercury, involving people like Gordon Cooper and Ed White and all these other people. But then they started the Apollo program, and it was actually this guy, who you may have heard the story of, Gus Grissom, who was meant to be the first man on the moon. And he was regarded as a loose cannon, and he had first-hand knowledge of the space program was in shambles. And there's no telling what he might say to the media. This is a quote from one of these web pages here. And if they were aware that putting a man on the moon by 1969 was impossible, he could expose the entire Apollo program as a sham, a PR stunt. And I've got some footage here from Apollo 0, which I'll play in a minute. Let's see. On January 22nd, 1967, Grissom made a brief stop at home before returning to the Cape. A citrus tree grew in their backyard with lemons on it as big as grapefruits. Gus yanked the largest lemon he could find off the tree. Betty, that's his wife, had no idea what he was up to, and asked him what he planned to do with it. "I'm going to hang it on the spacecraft," Gus said, and grimly kissed her goodbye. Let's see, and I think I've got this clip now.
Leading astronaut of the day, Gus Grissom, was slated to be the first man to walk on the moon. He was an outspoken man with the highest level of integrity. There was no way he would lie for anyone. He was also an outspoken critic of the dilapidated state of the moon program. Just before he died, he hung a lemon on the capsule and held a press conference in which he pointed out the sad state of the program. On the morning he died, upon having difficulty communicating from the capsule, he angrily asked,
"Hey, how are we going to get to the moon? We can't talk between three buildings."
In 1967, during a plugs-out test in which no engines were even ignited, they had him in a sealed capsule and pressurized it with 100% pure oxygen. A fire erupted, and all 3 astronauts perished. After this grisly incident, no other astronaut dared to criticize the program, and after all these years of lying and making their livings off the fame, none chooses to wreck this acclaimed success for the others by telling the truth. There is strong reason to doubt the fire was accidental. Page 81 of the Apollo 1 Accident Investigation Report, issued by the U.S. Congress, reveals that prior to the fire, NASA, by their own admission, were very well aware of the respective fires at the Johnsville Navy Air Station and Brooks Air Force Base. The fires in question, as pointed out by author Ralph Renee, were a result of sparks and even static electricity igniting the pure oxygen environments. In spite of these past fatalities, NASA used a 100% oxygen atmosphere in the Apollo 1 spacecraft, arguing that they had done it previously on the Gemini program. Of course they had. However, Gemini had a cabin pressure of only 3 pounds per square inch, the pure oxygen equivalent to the 14.7 pounds of nitrogen and oxygen at sea level. All previous aviation flash fires had been only slightly higher than Gemini's cabin pressure. Apollo 1's cabin pressure was more than 5 times higher. NASA was aware of the dangers, but they went ahead and sealed 3 of their astronauts inside a highly volatile capsule that had already been packed full of combustible and highly toxic materials, most of which were untested and had not been given their seal of approval before they were installed. The technicians on Pad 34 needed at least 5 minutes to open the command capsule's door. The astronauts had a mere 15 seconds before the fire consumed their cabin. Additionally, in 1999, when Grissom's son, Scott, was granted access to his father's spacecraft, he uncovered evidence that a metal plate had been shoved behind the dashboard to deliberately trigger a spark. Keep in mind that many of these scientists were war criminals imported from Hitler's Germany. One should not be surprised that such horrors could occur when one considers that these Nazis helped perpetuate the cruelest, most brutal atrocity that has ever taken place in the history of mankind.
Footage, the 2 clips I've used there are from a film called Apollo 0, which is available free online. So we've got a pretty sordid history already. People that criticise the program are basically killed. And they've got German rocket scientists behind it. So we're not in good shape. Okay, well, so supposedly they went aloft, they went to the moon, and what did they find there? As I mentioned in the introduction, a lot of people just talk about the shadows, and they'll sort of make various arguments about shadows on the Apollo, the Apollo craft on the surface and this sort of thing. And some of those are not, in my experience, are not valid. You can't really argue them one way or the other because you don't know the precise conditions. But then there's more obvious ones like this. We're told that there's almost no water on the moon. They claim to have found some recently in the polar regions with these various probes that have gone there. But again, I've made this point about pictures from Mars. If there is no surface moisture, how can you possibly get a picture like this? I mean, you can't get a picture like that without moisture because the dust particles bind together with the moisture. To me, that is made on an artificial set. And another obvious point: can can we be really sure that this was taken with a chest-mounted camera? Because remember, the Apollo... So you think of bending down like that, and that looks as if the camera is... I suppose it could be zoomed in and whatnot. Maybe that's not such a good argument, but, you know, I have my doubts as to whether simply the angle that that shot is taken at could have been taken by a chest-mounted camera. I would just take that simple observation and consider it. But there's much more than that.